Okay, hello, U.S. history students. This is Mr. Freeze.
And Mrs. Freeze here to talk to you about, this is our third lesson, urbanization during the Progressive Era.
So, around the turn of the century, around 1900, there's a movement of people in mass numbers to the cities of the United States. Cities are also known as urban areas. So, urbanization,
And
when
notice
you put
it's a red, bold, underlined word. So this is something you definitely want to take note of.
Yeah. So urbanization, if urban means city, urbanization means the growth of these cities. And during this time period, we are going to see cities grow exponentially in the United States due to two reasons. Number one, the Industrial Revolution is occurring, so people are coming into cities from other areas of the United States. And plus, we're also going to talk about the role that immigration and new people entering the United States will play in this growth of cities as well.
So if you look, now if you think back to middle school, this 1790, this would be a period that you guys would have talked about, and your teachers probably would have mentioned to you that back in that time, a lot of Americans were farmers. And if you weren't a farmer, you were living in some very small town somewhere where everyone knew everyone else. Before the Civil War, you have not any city in our country that is over 1 million people. So the big cities that you guys may have visited at some point in your life, whether it be Philly, New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, they were not what they are now. So 1900, if you look here, New York, Chicago, Philly, by that point, they have all grown to surpass 1 million people. So we're going to talk today about what is causing this to happen. Why are people moving to the cities? What can they expect when they get to these cities? And again, here's Manhattan. Here is New York City. So this is obviously an older picture, but cities really started to boom at this time. So here is a more current picture. And is there anything we want to say about this that I'm
Yeah, I think you can note a little something about this. If you go back to the previous picture, you'll see a big change, not only in the outskirts. If you look over here, you'll see that this is all now filled up with buildings. But if you notice something, if you go to the next slide, do you see what I'm going to talk about here? You also have buildings that are
tall,
that are reaching towards the sky.
I have
it's
a feeling
almost like they're
I
scraping
know.
the sky.
And I think I know who was helping to make those things.
Yeah.
But let's talk about that. So as Mr. Freeze just said, skyscrapers were being built. And if you're like, why would people do this? It maximizes on your space. So if you have tons of people moving into the cities and they all need places to live, if you're building buildings that aren't very tall, you have to build wide and take up tons of city blocks. Here, look how many more families you could fill going upwards here. Skyscrapers.
So just keep in mind, we just said that around the turn of the century, around 1900, not one city in the U.S. was over 1 million people. Today in New York City, the population of New York City is 8 million people. And these skyscrapers will allow for building apartments, factories, and things that can hold millions and millions of people.
And if you've never visited New York City, go there at some point. It is one of my favorite cities. It is awesome. Anyway, so if we're looking at these charts here, and a big part of U.S. history this year is going to be learning how to read things like charts and political cartoons and understand what they're showing you. And I actually think this one chart over here was in a previous lesson. But if you look, rural and urban populations. So if you look here for years, we're going from 1860 to 1920. Rural, meaning farming type area. You live out in the countryside. Urban, Mr. Freeze told you, means you're living in a city. And if you look here, our population is obviously from 1860 to 1920 growing in both of these columns. But I mean, if you look at urban areas, we're going from, in 1860, you had a little over 6 million Americans living in cities to here 54 million. So the definite trend is that urban life and cities are just booming in population. And we're going to talk about some of those people that are moving to cities are coming from farm areas. Some are coming from other countries. But if you look here in some of our major cities, New York, Philly, Boston, and there's a question that is being asked of you up here. At which year did more people in the US live in cities than in rural areas? And if this was a test question and it said to circle the year, hopefully, I'll pause for 1 second so you can just look at this for a minute. Hopefully you would be able to figure it out and circle the year. And that year is 1920. So hopefully you didn't find that too difficult, but these are skills we'll be working on throughout the year.
Okay, so those people who had money moved out to the suburb or suburban areas. Outside, sub means outside, urban means city. Some people...
Don't we live in a suburb?
I believe we do. In fact, Warminster and Southampton are both suburbs of Philadelphia. And why do people live here? Because some people don't want to live in a crowded city area, and especially in places like Pittsburgh. That visual that you see on the screen there, that was where I grew up. That was the area where I grew up, but that was back around the turn of the century when all the steel mills were pumping out at full blast there. And so if you had money, you were like, look, I don't want to live in all this pollution and all this poverty. I'm going to move out to the suburbs or the edges of the city. However, they weren't like they are today. Very few people had enough money to actually move into suburban areas or suburbs.
Yeah, later in the spring, we'll talk about the 1950s where everyone was moving to the suburbs. All right, so the obvious question here is, why are all these people moving to the cities? Why not just stay on the farm? Well, there's a few reasons here. The big thing is jobs. And what is going to happen on farms is as more and more machinery is used on farms, they need less and less people to actually work the farm. So some of those people need a new job. Some people might also have thought, wow, farming's a really hard job all the time, some heavy duty work there. So some people thought, a job in a factory in a city might be better.
In most cases, it was just about the same level of danger,
just as horrible,
if not more so.
There were no good jobs if you were working class back then. But farming wasn't fun, nor was factory work.
Still like today, the reason why my wife likes to go to the city, there's entertainment. There was shopping there. That's
shows,
where the action,
Broadway shows. Oh my gosh, just amazing things in the city. Awesome restaurants. Right, so there was more entertainment there. So that was awesome. And if you lived in the city, you had access to better technology. If you were on a farm at this point in history, you didn't have a toilet that flushed. You were still using an outhouse or a hole in the ground. If you lived on a farm up until like the 1930s, some farmers still didn't have electricity. And then also people that lived in cities had more anonymity than people who lived in rural areas. And if you don't know what anonymity means, and see, right now we're just recording this, so I can't even ask you, but I'll ask Mr. Freeze, what is anonymity?
Well, it kind of has the prefix for anonymous, and I know anonymous means that you don't know who it is. So
like if you write an anonymous note to someone they don't know?
Yeah. So look, some people wanted to go to the cities and start a new life, leave their background, leave their old history, and start a brand new, exciting life in the cities. And so there was a lot of optimism when people first said, I'm going to leave the farm for the cities. But once they got there, a lot of people were kind of struck by what they found.
So, and before we talk about what they found, because it's pretty bad, we're going to look at the people that came to cities. So as we said, it is some people who are just moving from farms, but also we have two large waves of immigrants that moved to the country at the time. Now, I will tell you the first wave is smaller and they have a few less obstacles to jump over than the second wave that comes. But here, just before we talk about immigration, you have to understand what it is. And so what immigration is, which I have a feeling most of you probably know, is when people move into a country from another country. Okay?
Like my family immigrated from Ireland and England and Germany.
Yes, Mr. Freeze is very into Ancestry.com. He could tell you all about where his family came from. What is emigration? So the words look very similar, but emigration, and think of the E as an exit. It's when you are leaving a country to move elsewhere. So maybe you're emigrating to France, or maybe you're emigrating to Australia or Canada.
Or like one of our teachers, Mr. Sander, who emigrated to Swaziland.
In Africa.
Yeah.
And that's where he lives now.
He left the United States. He is an emigrant with an E. The best way to remember that, E for exit and I for coming in. So the first wave is called the old immigration. And the way that I want you guys to think of this, think of like the seniors in our school. They're like the old kids. They've been here a while. These are the people who came into the country before the end of the Civil War, around that time, or a little bit afterwards. So they are the old kids.
And it doesn't mean they're actually older in age. It just means they come over here first. And if you're wondering, well, where are they coming from? They're coming before 1890. They're coming from places like Great Britain. Today, we might call that the UK, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia. If you don't know what Scandinavian countries are, Norway, Denmark, Sweden. So they're coming over, and for some reason, we have potatoes over here on the screen with the words push factor. And if I were wondering, some of you might be thinking, oh, I know a connection here.
Yeah, basically at this time, you have a potato famine going on in Ireland, and that's pushing people to leave Ireland because of the lack of food.
Because they were starving to death. That's a real big
so they
push
were like,
factor.
hey, I'd like to come to the United States. Now, the people are coming from this area. These are the old immigrants. The people are going to come to the United States first.
Kind of Northwest Europe, coming across the Atlantic Ocean to enter in the U.S.
Now, these people were English. They were literate. And what literate means, if you see it in there in red, literate means that you are able to read and able to write.
And that is hugely important in life, but particularly if you're moving to a new country and you need to find work and you need to be able to read street names and get yourself from point A to point B. It's hard to do anything without being literate.
And they were also Protestant, which is a type of religion. And the only group of those people that weren't Protestant were the Catholics. But the Catholics, even though they were discriminated against at first, assimilate and become part of American culture pretty quickly.
So again, and Protestants, they're a type of Christian. So are Catholics. If you're a Protestant, you're a Christian, you're just not a Catholic. And the thing is, at this point in our history, a lot of Americans were Protestant. So when we saw other Protestants moving here, we're like, all right, that's not bad. They're just like us. Believe it or not, we will not be as accepting to people who are not just like us.
So whether you're old or a new immigrant, these people came to the U.S. because they saw it as a land of opportunity. They're called pull factors. They're things that would entice people to come to the United States. Some people came here for a new start and a new beginning. Other people came here for freedom of religion, to escape persecution. And other people were like, I hear a lot of stories about these people like Andrew Carnegie, who came to the United States as a poor kid and grew up to be this really successful businessman and made millions and millions of dollars. These are called pull factors. They're reasons why people would want to come to the United States. The U.S. was seen as a land of opportunity.
And we'll see some of this was a little misleading. Like, yes, if you came here, for example, for religious freedom, you had it. It didn't mean that always people were nice to you if you were a different religion, whether it was Catholic or Jewish. And we'll see that not everyone ended up like Carnegie. So, right, we're going to come back to more of that. But wave two, the new immigrants, this is a much larger group that comes over between 1880 and 1920. So here you might recognize, here's the Statue of Liberty, and they're going to be coming in at a point that we're going to talk about in a minute. So a large group, and most of them are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. So not Germany, not England, not Ireland. They're coming from places like Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia, Eastern Europe. And so some of you, your family may have come over in this group. This was a very large group. So now would probably be a good time for you guys to talk with your family about when you came over here. And so if you remember, our first group came from about here. This group's coming from over here. And again, they're making that same journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately for these people, they're going to have a more difficult time. They're not going to be as easily accepted. Most came and they were very, very poor. Some of them did not even know what money was because they bartered in their old country. They traded things like, I'll give you these 3 chickens for that goat. And so they're not used to money. They don't have money. Most of them are not educated because where they came from, there may not have been schools to educate them, or they may have been forbidden from being educated. And most of them are illiterate. They cannot read, they cannot write. And because of that, they're going to have a really hard time. And some people, unfortunately, will try to take advantage of them. They come here with religions that are not quite what was the most common religions here. They were Catholic. And even though that is Christian, some Protestants here did not trust Catholics. Eastern Orthodox, so Christians from Russia, from Greece, and Jewish. So here were religions that came over, and they're going to find that even though they have freedom of religion here, people are not always nice to them. Like some Catholics found their churches burned down because people had such animosity towards them. So how they got here, it was a rather, probably, I think, scary journey, but they came by ship across the Atlantic Ocean in a trip that took several weeks. And again, if you were a poorer person, which most were, you were crowded below, you were crowded below decks in something called steerage. And you were crammed together, people got seasick. It was an unpleasant journey.
Now, 70% of these immigrants came through Ellis Island, which became nicknamed the Golden Door, because if you got to Ellis Island, there's a good chance. And if you don't know where Ellis Island is, we'll show you a picture right here. It's right by New York City. And when you saw that Statue of Liberty there, you were like, wow, I finally made it.
So excited to get off that boat, to be in this new country.
The problem is that if you got off that boat, it wasn't a guaranteed entrance into the nation. Some people spent their entire life savings moving to the United States. And when they got to Ellis Island, they all of a sudden figured out, look, America, although it held the promise of adventure and success, it was a difficult place for many immigrants, especially if you didn't speak English or have connections. In 1892, the government made it required that all immigrants take a physical exam. There was an eye disorder called trachoma, which they actually screened people for. And if you didn't pass the physical exam, you were actually sent back home, or you would be quarantined, which I think this year, I don't think we need to go over what quarantine means for the first time.
I think for one time, kids probably already just
I think everybody has a pretty good understanding of what it means to be quarantined.
Did I ever tell you that I went to Ellis Island for my 9th grade field trip?
You did not.
Well, I did, guys, in case you were sitting there wondering.
Okay, they were all wondering that. Let's move on. So a doctor examines a woman right here, and unfortunately, she was marked by an inspector, and she would be quarantined or sent back home due to some type of medical illness that she had. So where did people go once they arrived? Well, they stayed in cities where their families had already settled. In fact, you start to see cultural communities start to develop in cities as well. Italian people move into Italian neighborhoods.
So if you've ever been to like Little Italy or Chinatown, like
Jews move into Jewish areas. It's
like
really,
if you came here, you would, and you're already scared and nervous in this new place, you want to move where you know people that speak your language, if you have relatives here. And again, most immigrants did get in. It was a very small percentage that got sent back. So, I mean, we really see.
And our cities start getting flooded with people competing for jobs. Now, this leads to two different views. There's really two different perspectives on immigration to the United States, especially these new immigrants. If you remember, the ones that don't speak English and cannot read and write and don't have money. Some people, and I'm going to give the positive view here, some people view it as a melting pot, that all these nationalities are coming together and we have melted down these nationalities into one
American
family, one American identity.
Where we're enhanced by our diversity.
Thank you.
We are better for it.
I'm going to finish speaking here real quick while we talk about diversity here. Really, we do what's called assimilating. We are not German or Russian or Irish. We identify as Americans. However, other people view this immigration in the United States as we are just accepting trash from the rest of the world. We are accepting people who are not wanted in their home countries. And we've even seen reference to that in this current administration, where President Trump has said, look, let's limit immigration. Why do we want people from, and he used some pretty flowery language when he said this, but why do we want people from countries that aren't successful? Why don't we accept people from countries that are successful? And so we have these two different views of immigration that we'll see not only in this lesson, but throughout the history of the U.S.
And if you look at this cartoon, I mean, this almost could have been drawn in 2016 when Trump was talking about building his wall. And you see this guy in overalls here, American laborer, so an American worker who's asking our government to stop immigration. Why? Because he's worried about losing his job to immigrants. But again, if you think about our history, and if you look here, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, and if you look at how immigrants are being portrayed in this cartoon, they're being portrayed as criminals, as people are coming in to hurt the United States and cause damage. And again, you could take this cartoon from 1904 and really put it in 2016, and it would have made a lot of sense. You could just change some of the names and faces on there, and it would have made a lot of sense. In fact, in 2016, this was one of the reasons, if you remember, President Trump's campaign slogan, what are we going to do? Build the wall. Who's going to pay for it? Mexico. And there were calls to put up an actual physical barrier. This was just a metaphor. This actually was being built during the Trump administration.
But honestly, anyone who knows about the history of our country knows that we've always been a nation of immigrants. And so that again, our nation got started from people moving from other countries. So to deny that is really to just deny our history.
Right, but there's ebbs and flows as well. There are times where America is wide open immigration, and there are times where there's a backlash against that immigration as well.
So usually during tough times, we sometimes see a backlash.
Absolutely. So the rapid growth of cities led to a lot of problems, and we're going to run through these really, really quickly here. All right, the problems included low wages, gambling, violence. It involved crime, prostitution, and robbery. Measles spread really, really rapidly during that time, which was a pretty horrible disease. But in a lot of these cities, there was not social distancing. There was nobody shutting down factories saying, hey, we need a quarantine because there's an outbreak. Government kept its hands off. It was we'll learn about this, it was very laissez-faire, and said
cities were dirty.
Cities were incredibly dirty. There were millions of people coming into cities, and there wasn't a system. Government hadn't set up a system to collect garbage and sewage. So scenes like this, which you're going to be shocked by next, were pretty common. If a horse died on the road, there wasn't really a number you could call. Like you couldn't call the Warminster, Township Police and say, hey, we got a horse dead in the middle of Street Road. There was no government institution to come take that horse away. And if you're wondering, what are these kids doing in a gutter? That gutter was used to carry away. That was your sewage system as well. That gutter would carry away human waste. But it looked like it had freshly rained there. So this was also a time for kids to play in the water a little bit.
And if you look, these kids look completely unfazed by the dead horse and the dirt, because this is just how they were used to living, unfortunately. They didn't think anything of it.
And you may be saying, where are these kids' parents? And the answer is they're working. And the second thing is, and the second question here, why aren't they in school? Government didn't have school. School was only something that the very wealthy could actually afford. And most new immigrants to the United States or people living in cities could not afford to go to school.
Right. At this point, public schooling was not mandatory.
Right. And in a lot of cities, it wasn't even public. It wasn't available. There was also tenement housing. And if your parents are contractors or anything, you know that when you build a house, or even if you do a kitchen, or even if you replace a water heater, you need a permit so that they can make sure that it's put in correctly. Tenement homes were put up in the United States, all in these cities, and they were basically put up so quickly that they were built really, really poorly. And these tenement homes housed many families in the same apartments. In fact, you could see right there too, these were these tenement homes. That's how people would dry their laundry. And if you go to the PowerPoint, you guys can click here. It'll take you to a couple videos and pictures about these tenement homes as well, and the conditions that existed in the cities. We'll also leave links for that on our assignment. So it became obvious that reforms were needed. There were a ton of problems in American history. We need to make them better. And I'm going to burn this into your brain. You need to know what a reform is. A reform is a change for the better. All right? We did that one of the first lessons, but I'm really driving it home right now. A reform is a change for the better. We have all these problems right here: tenement housing, sanitation issues, kids not being in school. People for the first time are going to say, we need to look to the government to solve our issues. And the effort to make laws that the government would enforce to make reforms or changes for the better are going to be known. This whole movement is going to be known as the progressive movement, because we are going to make progress. We are going to make laws that the government will enforce that will make our country a more progressive country, or an effective running country, due to the government making these laws. So that's our lesson for today. There should be a short assignment for you guys to finish up following this. That's it for right now. We will see you guys next time. Bye.